Welcome back to iGen Politics. This is a podcast that makes politics engaging and relevant for all generations. My name is Victor Shi, a sophomore at UCLA, the youngest elected delegate for Joe Biden, and one of the co-hosts of this podcast.
And I'm Jill Wine-Banks, the author of The Watergate Girl, a former Watergate special prosecutor, and now an MSNBC legal analyst. I'm also the person who wears #Jill's pins. And today's pin is in special honor of our guest, because it honors military servicemen and women. It's a little hard to see, but we will post it in our show notes so that you can see the pin. When I had the honor of serving as the General Counsel of the Army during President Jimmy Carter's administration, I saw firsthand the sacrifice and courage that our military service members had. At the same time, I also recognized that there were many barriers, like the existence of the Women's Army Corps, that prevented women from advancing to their full potential. I worked with Congress to dismantle the Women's Army Corps and with military leaders to open most military occupational specialties, which is the job you are assigned in the military, based on qualifications, not on gender. So that if you were physically able to do the things that a job required, you could have that job. It didn't matter whether you were a man or a woman. Since then, I've had an opportunity to work with the Pentagon once again, this time working on rooting out sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military. And in that position, I learned a lot of lessons that I believe are applicable, not just in the military, but as we are now seeing to the toxic work environments that exist in civilian life, in government and in corporate life. Those things are very important that we pursue and look at, and we will talk to our guest about all of that.
Our guest today, Representative Jackie Speier of California, shares Jill's dedication to eliminating sexual assault in the military. We plan on talking about that, her time investigating Jonestown as a congressional aide, and what similarities it shares with the cult of Donald Trump, as well as her advice to young men and women of my generation hoping to enter public service. It's going to be a packed episode, but before we get into it, there's more to learn about Jackie Speier. Congresswoman Speier is a fearless fighter for women's equality, LGBTQ rights, and the disenfranchised who has dedicated her life to eliminating government corruption while working to strengthen America's national and economic security. She was named to Newsweek's list of 150 fearless women in the world and one of Politico's 50 most influential people in American politics for bringing the Me Too reckoning to Congress. She proudly represents California's 14 congressional districts and serves on the House Armed Services Committee and as the chair of the Military Personnel Subcommittee on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, where she serves on the subcommittees on environment and government operations. Speier is also the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus, the Congressional Armenian Caucus, and the Bipartisan Task Force to End Sexual Violence and the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Thank you so much for being here, Representative Speier. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, Representative Speier.
It's great to be with you.
So we first met when you brought one of your constituents to testify before a Pentagon committee that I was a member of, and we were investigating sexual assault in the military, an issue that, as Victor said in introducing you, both of us care deeply about. This is a big problem in the military, and as we are seeing now in other government offices and in civilian workplaces too. I've heard you say that the damage goes far beyond the impact on the survivor of the sexual assault and affects the entire unit or workplace. And I thought that would be a good place to start if you could expand on that a little.
Thank you, Jill. And let me just say at the outset how pleased I am to be on your show and how much I regard you as a profoundly articulate spokesperson for women and someone who has over the decades shown that she's got what it takes to be a very effective leader.
I'm blushing if you can't see.
So Yes. 20,000, think about it, 20,000 service members sexually assaulted every year. And only about 5,000 feel they have the ability to report it because so many of them fear retaliation. So, what it does to the whole unit is it creates a cancer. And I can't tell you the number of service members who have said to me when they wanted to report, they were told by their um, counselor or by their commander, you don't want to wreck the service member's career. Um, you really don't want to do this. Isn't there a way you could just get over it? And as we all know, those who are victims of sexual assault, men and women, don't get over it. It is a scar that is with them often the rest of their lives. And I chair the military personnel subcommittee. My job is to make sure that our service members are treated fairly, that they have the resources they need, that they have the support for their families and children, and most importantly, that they're safe. And under this particular framework, in which you have to report up the chain of command, you are not safe because oftentimes the perpetrator is in the chain of command or the best friend of the chain of command, or the commander is reluctant to do anything about it because they don't want to have a blemish on their record when they're going to be up for promotion in the next 6 months or a year. So it is so important to take these cases out of the chain of command and put them in the hands of special prosecutors who are trained to handle these kinds of cases, have investigators who are trained to investigate these cases, and then make a decision whether or not to move forward with a case. But then you create the confidence among the service members that they're being treated fairly.
That's such a great answer. And I want to follow up more on that and explain to our audience right now that commanders are, of course, not lawyers. They are advised by a staff judge advocate, a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps who is a lawyer. But they are responsible for their unit. And when the complaint is from a member of their unit, and the commander could be a man or could be a woman, when they get a complaint from someone in their unit, it may often be against someone else in their unit. And there has been a perception that they, the commander, worry about how it will look if they couldn't control their members and that they are having this kind of problem in their unit. And so you have been a very strong advocate for taking the reporting out of the chain of command. And normally, if you were in civilian workforce, of course, you wouldn't report it to your boss. It's a crime. You would go to a prosecutor or the police, and it would be handled totally separate and apart. So the number of assaults has not diminished recently. And so now there is some real attention to this, taking it away from the commander and looking for a different view. And I'm just wondering if you agree with the assessment that there is a need to take it out and to stop discouraging survivors from coming forward. And you mentioned retaliation. And of course, we've seen retaliation in the episode with Lindsey Boylan, who was complained about Governor Cuomo and was retaliated against. So do you agree with that assessment? And what do you think Congress can do to change this?
So I do agree with that assessment. It's important to point out that the Uniform Code of Military Justice, under which all these cases are handled, is a creation of the Congress, not of the military, but of the Congress back in 1950. So it's our obligation, frankly, to improve upon that code, to amend that code if it's not representing the kind of justice that all of our service members deserve. Now, I will say that I've been working on this issue for 10 years. And I was hit with a stone wall within the military. And frankly, many of my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, did not want to rock the boat because it was somehow seen as being unpatriotic if we weren't supporting the services. But the truth of the matter is that we weren't supporting our service members. And you can't have cohesion, you can't have readiness, you can't have good order and discipline if you are allowing a perpetrator to be a predator and continue to assault people. Now, I can't take credit for this finally coming to a head as it has this year. I give credit, regrettably, painfully, to a young Army specialist who was murdered at Fort Hood. Her name was Vanessa Guillen. She was bludgeoned by a fellow service member in the arms room, was dismembered, was put into a tough box, and carted out to an obscure location where her body parts were buried in separate graves, and the perpetrator, came back a second and third time with his girlfriend to pour cement over the burial site. And for 2 months, everyone was looking for her. We had a terrible situation in the criminal investigative division in the Army because 93% of the investigators were novices, they were apprentices. So they weren't looking at the phone records of the perpetrator. I mean, they finally identified the perpetrator, but then, it was on the day that they found her body. And they had plenty of opportunity earlier on to take his phone, to check it. They didn't. They didn't do just some of the fundamental things you would do in an investigation like this. So her tragic murder became a rallying cry for women who had served in the military. I am Vanessa Guillen was hashtagged, and women and men, because it happens to both men and women in the military. A disproportionate number of women based on their population, but the numbers are like 60-40 in terms of both men and women being assaulted. So it was her death, her murder, the grisly nature of it that really captured the attention of members, that I couldn't get their attention to deal with this, even though we had spent over the last 10 years $2 billion, we figured, in more programs that, we have zero tolerance, but nothing was really changing. The numbers weren't going down, the numbers actually were going up. And what was worse is that we saw it in the military academies. And that to
Yes.
me is chilling because, I have the privilege of appointing these young cadets and midshipmen, and to think that I now have to counsel, particularly the women, that they could be sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, and they need to, know that I have their back. I shouldn't have to do that. Not for the next generation of leaders of our military, that somehow we're kind of creating that within the construct, into the culture. And so, things are about to change, but it's a lot of lives have been lost, and a lot of lives have been scarred permanently because of it.
I want to stay on this track, but you mentioned academies, and I'm going to come back to that because I think that's a very, very important issue. But I think you alluded to things are going to change, and that's partly because under President Biden, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has expressed his willingness to change. And as you know, when I served on this committee under President Obama, our jurisdiction did not include an ability to look at the chain of command. That was specifically excluded from anything we could study. But that is what is now being looked at. And so are you pleased with what Secretary Austin is doing in terms of this issue?
So, as you know, Jill, he stood up an independent review commission to evaluate this issue. it was on the heels of an independent review committee that looked at Fort Hood and gave a scathing report of what was going wrong there and why this happened and all the changes that should be made. So they, under Lynn Rosenthal, the chair of this independent review commission, they came up with recommendations. I'm very impressed with their recommendations. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has embraced some of them, but not all of them. And so we intend, through the National Defense Authorization Act, to embrace more of the recommendations of the Independent Review Commission, because not only were they focused on sexual assault and sexual harassment, but they also wanted to create these special victims crimes and a special victims unit. So issues around child abuse and domestic violence and stalking, all of those other kinds of conduct would be swept up into this kind of review and an independence that it desperately needs in the military.
So what would you like him to do that he has not embraced?
So the system right now would have him report through the TJAG, so that the lawyer who's in charge of all the lawyers within the military. We want to see this special victims unit report to the secretary of each of the services. We want to make sure that all conduct that's non-military in nature be subject to this kind of review, because in the course of all of this, we became aware through a GAO study that service members who are service members of color are more likely to be charged with crimes than their white colleagues. And so if you take these cases out of the chain of command, there's this sense that there's going to be greater equity as well. So that's the direction in which we are going. We want to make sure that anyone under the age of 18 would be swept into this kind of protective review, and also have the benefit of special victims counsel and the prosecutor that would review these cases independently of the chain.
When you mentioned special victims counsel, it was one of the things that impressed me about the military was how they have developed a special process to help victims of sexual assault. And they have their own counsel, but they also have an advocate, and they have someone who will help take them to medical care or to counseling sessions, someone who will help get them new bed sheets so that they don't have to sleep in the bed where they may have been raped. And so they have been, I would say, in some regards, ahead of the civilian population in terms of those sorts of things, but it's still within the military system. And I want to go back to the academies, which you mentioned, because one of the most dramatic things that I saw when I was on this committee, we did field visits, and we went to the Air Force Academy, was one of the places. And while we were there, we met some people who were involved in training the students. And I made assumptions about the caliber of people who are there, that they would have, I mean, you have to be really special to get into any of the service academies. But the thing that we learned was that most of the young men who were students at the Air Force Academy didn't even have an understanding of what a healthy relationship was with a female. And so they did not understand that a woman had a right to say no. They didn't understand what the limits were. And if we don't start training them, therefore, at the academy, this is going to continue as they move up in the ranks to higher and higher officer positions. So what has your experience been with the academies that you think needs attention?
I actually serve on the Board of Visitors at the Air Force Academy, and I have been, working on this issue assiduously, really, for probably 7 or 8 years, and to see these young cadets who've been sexually assaulted and the strength with which they continue to pursue their academic careers is pretty remarkable. Um, but it's chilling to know that these are the best and the brightest. This is the cream of the crop. These are
Yes.
young people that have applied to the academies, who've been selected by their members of Congress and their senators, and who have high academic success, who are great athletes and show great leadership qualifications. And to think that 51% of the female cadets and midshipmen at these academies have experienced sexual harassment, and only 1% have reported it. 16% of Academy men have experienced sexual harassment. In terms of sexual assault, the cases are about 15% of the female cadets have experienced sexual assault, and 2.4% of the male cadets. So there's a problem, and the services have said to me, in fact, it was said to me when I was at Fort Hood, that one of the problems when they get these young recruits in today is, one, they have not dated. They go on group dates, so they don't know how to
Yes.
behave.
Yeah.
And the second thing is they don't know how to drive. So they're about to drive these massive pieces of military equipment, and they first have to train them on how to drive a car because they haven't had that experience. So, it's a different universe of young people who are coming into the military and coming into the academies, but that doesn't mean that somehow you can get away with not showing each other the kind of respect that you deserve.
For sure. And I would love to spend the full time talking about this, but I think Victor would like to ask some questions from having looked at your book, Undaunted. So Victor, why don't you go
first,
ahead?
thank you so much for all of your work on rooting out sexual assault from the military. I think you said, this is for creating a better, life for future servicemen and women of future generations. So I know they will be forever indebted to what you're doing right now. But yeah, let's turn to your fascinating memoir, Undaunted, which I think may give you a unique perspective on former President Trump supporters. This is a event that my generation may not understand fully, but you were shot 5 times and survived the Jonestown massacre. So let's start with a very brief description of Jonestown, maybe its cult headquartered in San Francisco and its leader, Jim Jones, the massacre in Guyana, and why you were there covering the Jonestown massacre.
So, as you point out, Victor, Jim Jones was a reverend in a local church in San Francisco called the People's Temple. He had ingratiated himself with the political elite in San Francisco. He had 2,000 to 3,000 members in his congregation that could go out and walk precincts for candidates, and so he was held in high regard. He served as chair of the Housing Commission and the Human Rights Commission at different points in time. He helped make sure that at the time that George Moscone there had been attempted recall, and they were successful in helping him stay in office. So with that backdrop, I was working at the time for a congressman named Leo Ryan, and a number of his constituents, young adult children, had gotten involved in this church because it was pitched as a coming together of African Americans and whites in a utopian kind of environment, pooling resources, creating a better worldview. And so it attracted a lot of young people, and it attracted a lot of people who were disaffected, a lot of senior citizens who were poor and without resources. So it was a combination of people. Well, Congressman Ryan's constituents, parents, came to him and said, I'm really concerned about my young adult child. He's gotten involved in this church. He won't communicate with us. They've given all of his worldly belongings to the church. Then we heard from former members of the People's Temple who had left, and they talked about sexual abuse and physical abuse, and mind control. So Congressman Ryan decided he was going to find out. Meanwhile, Jim Jones decided to take about 900 of his members to a commune he had been creating in Guyana. And he picked Guyana in part because the prime minister there was a Marxist, and he kind of was very attracted to the Marxist kind of world order. And there was a story about to come out in a news magazine about Jim Jones that was not favorable. So he, in the middle of the night, so to speak, took 900 members down there. And one member in particular eventually defected, went to the State Department, to the embassy in Georgetown, Guyana, and got out. We interviewed her. And Congressman Ryan was kind of a person that really wanted to see things firsthand. He wasn't willing to just take the State Department's view that everything was terrific there. People were happy. So we made the trip down there, eventually got invited to People's Temple in Jonestown, and took a small aircraft to this beat up runway, got onto a dump truck, and we were taken to this commune and in the jungles. I mean, it was as you would expect a jungle to look like. It took forever to get to the commune, but you get there and you were pretty impressed. They were growing crops. You had cabins. Everything looked reasonable. There were members of the media who also were in attendance with us, and Congressman Ryan talked with all of the hierarchy there. We had gotten letters from family members. We were hand delivering them. We asked to speak to each of them, and over the course of the evening, one of the news reporters received a note that said, "I want to get out of here." And so that's how we found out that, in fact, people were being held there against their will. To make a long story as short as possible, the next day, in an effort to get everyone who wanted to leave out, we get to the airstrip, and unbeknownst to us, a tractor trailer followed behind us and started shooting it. Congressman Ryan was shot 45 times. I was shot 5 times on that airstrip and left for dead. And it was a harrowing experience. But it was an example of how a megalomaniac had used religion to obscure his conduct. And over the course of, 10 or 20 years as a pastor, had become, in his own mind, so godlike that he could control people. And so that night, as I'm lying on that airstrip, word came down to us. That's before cell phones, I might add. This is 1978. That there had been this, they were calling it a suicide, where he had, over time, had trained them that they might have to do this white knight trial. And he called them all to the pavilion, and they either drank this Kool-Aid laced cyanide or injected it into their arms of children, and they died. Some 900 people died there. I don't call it suicide. I call it a mass murder, because I don't think those people were in control of their faculties. And so, to fast forward to Donald Trump, there are some similarities, frankly. There is cult-like behavior going on by some of those who worship at his feet. And it was evident on January 6th when so many of these people took the orders from Donald Trump: go up to the Capitol, fight like hell, we've got to win this, and told them to go and overturn an election. And they came and beat up on police officers and ravaged the Capitol, and were looking to assassinate the vice president and the Speaker of the House. So, there are similarities.
If I can go back to Jonestown and ask one follow-up question. You mentioned that young people and and older people were really lured into this cult. I'm wondering what some of the tactics were that Jones used to really lure people into the People's Temple, and then not only lure people in, but also keep them in that cult.
So, it wasn't advertised as a cult, of course. It was advertised as a church. And he was able to cure people. He was able to bring people in and create a family. Many of these people, whether they were young or old, were disassociated with family, and they were lonely, and they were looking for something that would somehow complete their lives. So he provided that. And for young people who, this is the 70s, looking to create a utopian world. It was after the civil rights movement. We were trying to look at ways that we could all live together, and they saw this as a grand experiment in that kind of an experience. So there were what was strange about it, though, that was very obvious to me. It was operated like a plantation. The hierarchy of the People's Temple was made up of white people, and the African Americans were, the worker bees. And so it actually was more reminiscent of a bygone time when people were being taken advantage of. In this case, as it was historically, it was African Americans.
Right.
So given the similarities that you've identified between Jones as a cult leader, with the tragic outcome that had, and the similarities to January 6th, incited by President Trump, which I think the evidence is very clear he did, and the danger to our democracy, I'm wondering what you think needs to be done by Congress and maybe by the Department of Justice to hold the president and the Republicans who have supported him, who have continued his big lie. What can Congress and what can the Department of Justice do to make sure this doesn't happen again and that he is held accountable, he and the Republican comrades?
Well, certainly the Select Committee is a first step in addressing that. The Department of Justice has, been bringing many of these rioters to court and charging them. I think they've got to be charged not with a $2,000 fine, but with time and significant fines to make sure that this kind of conduct doesn't happen again. What makes this so frightening to me is that the internet was used to bring persons who didn't necessarily know each other together, and in that way create this anarchy. And that's, many of the people that were engaged in these activities were Trump supporters, but many also were people that just wanted to overthrow the government, and they saw this opportunity of using Donald Trump, and Donald Trump saw this opportunity of using them. So it was this toxic brew. So we've got these cells of domestic terrorists in this country that we've got to ferret out. We've got to find them and hold them accountable for their conduct. When you had a group of people who decided they were going to kidnap the governor of Michigan because they didn't like mask mandates and assassinate her, when does reality step in and prove that you don't do that? And so I think that we have a lot of work to do, and I think we're going to have to do a lot of intensive FBI intelligence work to find out where these groups lurk and what their goals are.
Do you think that the Department of Justice has been aggressive enough, or should they be bringing more cases at a higher level. And by higher level, I mean higher level of felony, and not just the people who were at the Capitol doing the damage, but the people who enticed them to get there, from the president on down.
You know, Jill, I haven't looked at it closely enough to make an assessment. I think the judge who opined earlier this week that, you know, the American people, the taxpayers, are picking up the tab $500 million to address all the damage and the kinds of resources that now have to be spent to protect the Capitol versus, you know, $2,000 fines. It's like, you know, these men and women were on some joyride, and you know, they're getting slapped on the hand. So it's serious. What they did was an attempt at a coup, and we need to call it that, and we need to hold them accountable for that. Now, does that mean imprisonment, and for how long? I can't make that assessment personally, but I think we've got to call it what it was. It was an attempted coup.
I have a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag say this, not that. And it's things like, let's call it a coup because that's what it was. And there are many other examples. Call it a lie because it is a lie. These aren't just misstatements. They're deliberate lies with an intended consequence. And I think Victor has a question he wants to ask before we wrap up.
Yeah, so maybe to end on a lighter note, what advice do you have for my contemporaries who want to become an elected official like you? And I'm wondering now if your advice is the same for young men and women.
I think my advice would be the same for young men and women. I think the advice that I would give you that I did not take was don't wait in line. Don't expect someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, you should do this. If you believe there's been an injustice, if you believe that you can fix what's wrong in your city, your state, your country, then you should put yourself out there and you should run. You do have to have a fire in your belly. You do have to make a compelling case for why you and not someone else, and be willing to do that. And you've got to be willing to fail. I love to tell young people that they're looking at a 3-time loser, because I've lost 3 times. I lost for student body president in high school. I lost the first time I ran for Congress. I lost for lieutenant governor of California. But every time you lose, you really win, because you learn so much more about yourself and you're prepared, frankly, to lead better. So don't be afraid to fail is the other advice I'd give you.
That is great advice, and I'm especially glad you said it was the same advice for young men and women, because when Victor talked to me about asking this question, I said, you need to rephrase it, because I think it sounds sexist, because he was going to ask you basically what advice you had for young women who wanted to run. And I said, why are you limiting it to women? She's a woman, yes, but she's a member of Congress, and she can give advice to anyone who wants to be a member of Congress. So you've sort of settled the debate as far as I'm concerned, right,
yes,
Victor?
Definitely. I mean, that was a perfect way to end. And Representative Speier, thank you so much for joining Jill and me today.
Well, it's my great pleasure, Victor. And Jill, always great to be with you.
Thank you. I hope you'll come back again and we'll talk more about the military. There's so much more to cover on that.
There is. There's lots of issues around suicide and domestic violence and so many other issues, childcare that we have ignored. So yes, I say yes, I'll come back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Speier.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Victor, I loved our conversation with Congresswoman Jackie Speier, and I want to follow up with you on something that, as I mentioned in our talking with her, that I was extremely disturbed at learning that the young men at the Air Force Academy really had never had the experience of forming a healthy relationship with a woman, and that the leaders at the Air Force Academy, and by the way, the superintendent was a woman, a job she could not have held if the Women's Army Corps hadn't been eliminated. I just want to say that, because Without that, she would have been restricted to jobs that were in the WACs, not in the regular Army. That they were finding that they needed to really start training people in not just what is consent, but really what is a healthy relationship. And I'm just wondering if, since it's your generation that's getting this training, whether you've had that training and how you feel about being able to form healthy relationships with other people.
When I think of relationships, the first thing that pops into my mind is social media, because I think social media does so much to weaken what I think is a healthy or maybe a meaningful relationship. A lot of the times my generation says, I'll talk to you, and it's via text rather than in person. And maybe, during COVID that was, kind of an unavoidable thing. You had to text or you had to FaceTime, but still not in person. But I think, when it comes to getting into a formal relationship or dating, I think back to Me Too, and for young people, especially of my age, we look to Me Too and we think of that big moment in history right after the inauguration of Donald Trump. And I think that really changed things for how my generation sees at least formal relationships and dating. Afterwards, before we were gonna do this chit chat, I told Jill, but it was my freshman year. I had no requirement of going through what consent meant or what that means when you enter a relationship, how to approach a woman and ask for that. And my sophomore, junior, and senior year, consent and teaching that was required in all health classes, at least in my high school. And so I found that really interesting. And as a result, a lot of my friends, maybe the friendships weren't meaningful, but the relationships that they were in, they really made sure to keep that in mind, because I think that was just such a big cultural kind of sticking point for young people. And so I think my generation, we're really understanding what it means for consent because of Me Too. And I'm not sure that would have happened if it weren't for Me Too. But I'm curious to hear what your generation's experience with that and relationships and how you think that's changed. We've mentioned social media, but what you think are some of the biggest changes since your time dating?
Yeah, I mean, obviously things are very different. I would have never said, I'll talk to you, and thought that it would be via text. It meant that I would actually talk, and exchange a conversation where we talk simultaneously, not you say something and then eventually I read it and answer you. But I think probably the issues were the same in terms of training. Maybe there were healthier relationship images. This is the time of Daddy Knows Best and Ozzie and Harriet, and we saw families and happy relationships, and we didn't see so much of the abuse and harassment. But harassment was rampant when I was in college. I mean, in the sense of women weren't respected, women weren't expected to do all the things that the men did, and I had no sort of role models. I just had to figure out how to do what I wanted to do, regardless of the fact that I was a woman entering a man's field. And so I think that's important. But one big difference is that we dated. We went out one-on-one. We didn't go to the prom, a bunch of girls and a bunch of boys. We paired up. And it seems like what I saw when I was on this committee looking at sexual assault is that in the military and in the academies, there are groups of people who go out. They're men and women, and they aren't necessarily an equal number of each. It's just a group goes out. And so that to me is something very different than my experience of dating, which was a serially monogamous relationship where you were with one person for a while and then maybe you would break up and go out with someone else. That may be the biggest difference.
I will, just one final point on that. I will say that after talking with some of my friends who have dating apps like Tinder, Hinge, Bumblebee, or I haven't gone through that yet, but My generation, we also aren't as serious about our, at least first relationships, or we aren't as serious about dating. A lot of the time, young people actually kind of go through just a series of informal relationships and test the waters, which I guess you can, argue, that could raise, the possibility of misconduct. But we don't take things as seriously with our relationships because of the dating apps and the number of possibilities that we think we have. And so that's another thing that I think my generation is unique to my generation, is just the number of dating apps out there, and maybe the not so seriousness of the relationship.
Wow, that's really very interesting. And I'd be interested to hear from our audience about their experiences with both sexual harassment, sexual assault, dating, forming relationships. I'd be curious as to how you see it, whether you're from my generation or from Victor's generation. Let us hear from you.
Of course. You can do that via Twitter or email us, but you can do that wherever you find your podcasts. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of iGen Politics. We hope you tune in next week for our next episode, and follow wherever you get your podcasts.